Okay, let's dig into this. The world consumes, well, an incredible amount of oil. We're talking over 100 million barrels
Huh.
every single day.
Yeah, it's a staggering number when you actually stop to think about it.
It really is, and that scale, it just prettily sets the stage for what we're exploring today, right? The current state of global energy. We're focusing particularly on the oil market dynamics and, well, some pretty significant geopolitical shifts we're seeing.
It's quite striking, actually, how these things connect. You've got elections happening here, production decisions over there,
Uh-huh.
and they all weave together to shape this global energy picture. They're really deeply interconnected.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what this deep dive is for you listening. We want to get beyond just the headlines,
Mm.
really help you understand the forces underneath it all. We've looked at some interesting news analysis, expert commentary to help you get a quick handle on this really critical issue. So, our mission, if you like, is to pull out the most important insights about what's happening with oil, what's driving it all, and maybe where things could be heading.
And a key piece of this, right from the start, is how recent politics are feeding into it.
Mm.
We've seen some pretty notable elections, some political shifts that have, well, direct and indirect consequences for energy.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe Canada. They just had their 45th federal election,
Hmm.
and it happened amid quite a bit of economic uncertainty, trade issues with the U.S., that kind of thing.
Yeah, and Canada being such a major energy producer globally,
Right.
its political direction, its stability, that all matters on the world stage. It has implications.
So the main players were the Liberals, led by Mark Carney, and the Conservatives with Pierre Poilievre. Of course, you also had the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, and the Bloc Québécois under Yves-François Blanchet.
Hmm.
But what was interesting was the polling. There was a big swing. The Conservatives, they had a strong lead initially.
They did, yeah.
But right before the vote, the Liberals actually pulled ahead.
And what's possibly behind that shift is interesting. It seems external factors played a big role. Rising concern among Canadians about trade, especially with the U.S., maybe a potential Trump return.
Right, the tariff threats and all that.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And perhaps a feeling that Carney might be, better positioned to handle that relationship. It kind of points to this deeper anxiety in Canada about the U.S. economic connection,
Yeah,
maybe even overriding some usual domestic political thinking.
that's the analysis we're seeing, yeah. U.S.-Canada relations apparently became a top issue for almost half the voters there. But of course, you still had the big domestic things, affordability, groceries, housing
Oh,
costs,
absolutely.
inflation, healthcare. Those were definitely being debated too.
Which just highlights how, domestic worries and international economic realities are often tangled up, especially when you're right next door to the U.S.
Totally. So the election itself was on a Monday. Polls opened across all 6 time zones. And get this, a record 7.3 million Canadians voted in advance.
Wow, that's high engagement.
Yeah. And just quickly, for anyone maybe less familiar with how it works there, you vote for a local candidate in your area you're writing.
Right.
Whoever gets the most votes wins that seat. The party with the most seats, the most MPs, usually forms the government. You don't actually vote directly for prime minister.
So a change in who's governing could genuinely mean shifts in energy policy, how they approach resources, trade deals,
Uh-huh.
all things that could ripple out into the global oil market.
Okay, so let's move across the pond. England had local elections on May 1st. County councils, 4 regional mayors.
Right. And while these are local, they often get read as a kind of temperature check on national feeling.
Yeah, judgment maybe on the new conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch.
Potentially, yeah. It's seen that way sometimes. An early test.
It's worth remembering, though, the last time these specific seats were up, back in 2021, the conservatives were riding pretty high. That whole vaccine boost thing was happening.
That's a really good point. The context is just so different now, it makes direct comparisons, well, a bit tricky.
Right.
And you've also got Reform UK being more visible now, which adds another dynamic to the mix in English politics.
True. So maybe reading the tea leaves from these results is a bit nuanced, especially since a lot of the councils were already in conservative areas.
Mhm.
But, significant losses for the governing party could still hint at a wider shift nationally.
Which could then maybe indirectly influence the national conversation around energy, environmental rules, the pace of the energy transition, all that.
Okay, now let's shift again, eastward this time, to Romania, their presidential elections. Wow, that's been quite a situation.
Yeah, quite something. Originally set for November 2024, but the results actually got thrown out, annulled.
And the reason given was pretty serious. Concerns about Russian interference.
Exactly. Specifically around the initial win by a candidate seen as pro-Russian, Kellen Georgescu.
It's a pretty stark reminder, isn't it? These ongoing efforts to potentially sway democratic processes.
It really is.
Yeah.
And this situation in Romania is being watched closely as a real test for their democratic institutions.
And it fits a pattern, maybe. You hear about similar concerns, alleged Russian disinformation campaigns in other Eastern European countries like Georgia, Moldova.
Yeah, often around key moments like votes on EU membership or, general geopolitical alignment.
So after that annulment, Georgescu was barred from running in the new elections, which were rescheduled for May 4th and 18th. And that decision, well, it caused protests and debate in Romania.
Understandably. It brings up big questions about, maintaining trust in the vote and how best to respond when you have credible allegations of foreign meddling.
So in these new elections, the main contenders were George Simion. He's the leader of the far-right AUR party, often described as kind of Trumpist.
Mm-hmm.
And he was apparently leading in the polls. Then you had Victor Ponta, a former prime minister, and Nichior Dan, who's the independent current mayor of Bucharest.
Right, and their platforms, their potential policies, are really worth watching, especially given what Romanian voters are actually worried about.
And those worries seem quite significant. Things like feeling left behind economically compared to other EU countries.
Yeah, that socioeconomic lag.
A declining population, job market issues, rising cost of living, food security worries, the gap between cities and rural areas.
A lot of pressure points.
And just a general anti-establishment feeling, it seems.
And these domestic pressures, they absolutely shape foreign policy, too. International partnerships, energy deals, infrastructure projects. Like Romania's support for Ukraine, which was initially very strong.
Right.
That seems to have maybe softened a bit in public opinion lately.
That's what we're reading, yeah. Apparently a rise in nationalist feeling and just more focus on these urgent domestic problems might be shifting attitudes about, how much support to keep sending Ukraine.
So you really see how it all connects: internal politics, worries about outside interference, regional conflicts. It all influences where a country is headed. And that can have these knock-on effects globally, including, of course, in the energy markets.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's shift focus directly to that global stage now and really get into the oil market itself. You've got some key insights here, starting with that massive consumption figure we mentioned.
Yes, over 100 million barrels a day. And crucially, demand is actually increasing. A big driver for that is Asia, especially with China's economy reopening after all the pandemic restrictions. That's been a major factor.
And yet, even with demand rising and supply generally quite tight, OPEC Plus recently decided to cut production again.
That's right, another 1.2 million barrels per day reduction. It definitely surprised a lot of market watchers.
Yeah.
And it pretty quickly pushed prices up. We're seeing oil trading above $80 a barrel now. The implications of that for global growth, maybe sparking energy inflation again, they're pretty significant. What's really interesting there, potentially, is the strategy. Maybe some OPEC Plus members are aiming for higher prices over the longer term, even if it risks, dampening demand a bit down the road. It might not just be about immediate profit.
So who are the really big players in this global oil game right now, production-wise?
Well, volume-wise, the top three globally are the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Russia.
Okay.
And on the consumption side, the biggest users are the U.S., China, and India. China is the world's single largest importer of crude.
And Russia's oil exports. That's been fascinating to watch, given all the sanctions.
It really has. I mean, despite sanctions from many Western countries, Russia has managed to keep its export volumes relatively high.
How?
Well, they found new buyers, places like Turkey, Singapore, China, India, often at discounted prices, mind you.
Ah, okay.
And they're using this so-called shadow fleet of tankers to move the oil, plus pipelines like the big one going directly to China, the East Siberian Pipeline.
But what about the long term for Russia's energy sector? Does this have consequences?
That's the big question, really. The lack of access to Western tech and investment for maintaining and upgrading their infrastructure. That's likely going to bite them down the line.
Yeah.
It'll probably affect their production capacity and efficiency over time.
Okay. And then there's Venezuela. They sit on the world's biggest proven reserves, right? But they produce hardly anything compared to that potential.
Exactly. Huge reserves, but production is way down. It's a mix of political instability and just a massive lack of investment in their oil infrastructure over years.
Mhm.
Plus, their oil is heavy crude, it's more complex and energy intensive to refine, tends to have more sulfur, so a higher carbon footprint too. For Venezuela to really get back into the global market in a big way, you'd need major political shifts and huge amounts of international investment.
What about Africa's role in all this?
Very important. Oil and gas are absolutely vital for economic growth and just getting energy access to people across the continent.
But there are challenges.
Oh, yes. Many African nations find it hard to get funding, especially from some Western financial institutions that are reluctant to back new fossil fuel projects now.
Right.
But despite that, energy demand in Africa is expected to grow significantly.
Mm.
You see some interesting pipeline proposals, like Nigeria looking to send gas north to Algeria, maybe even Europe via Morocco, though the practicality varies. Algeria itself is already becoming a more important gas supplier to Europe.
And the Russia-Ukraine war, that's clearly shaken up Europe's energy plans in a big way.
No question. A major consequence has been Europe hitting the accelerator on renewables. They're desperately trying to cut that reliance on Russian gas.
So lots of focus on green industrial policy, clean energy investment.
Absolutely. And you see it in things like the EU's taxonomy. That's their classification system for what counts as a sustainable investment. Huge debates around that, especially the role of nuclear, even natural gas in the transition.
But they still need gas, right?
Oh, for sure. They're still relying heavily on non-Russian gas sources. And actually, they even still import some Russian liquefied natural gas, LNG.
No, India and China buying up discounted Russian oil. That seems like a really strategic play by them.
It definitely looks that way. It's driven by, well, clear economic benefits for them, but also energy security, making sure they have the supplies they need.
Right.
India, for example, is really boosting its refining capacity. And some of those refined products, they're actually being re-exported.
Interesting.
And China seems to be using this chance to build up its strategic oil reserves. There's also, the possibility that some of this trade, maybe through new trading houses or relabeling oil, could be getting around the intended bite of the sanctions.
Okay, one last piece here. Nuclear energy. It keeps coming up in these energy future discussions.
It does, and it's important because it's a basically zero-emission electricity source, so it plays a big role in decarbonization plans.
But attitudes towards it vary wildly, don't they?
Yeah, hugely. You've got China, Saudi Arabia building new reactors, then lots of debate in Europe. France and Sweden seem to be perhaps shifting back towards it more favorably. But in the U.S., there's still big challenges caused. Public perception.
Right.
Still, most credible paths you look at for getting to net zero emissions by, say, 2050, they include a pretty significant chunk of nuclear power.
Okay, so bringing this all together, it's just an incredibly complex picture, isn't it?
It really is. The whole global energy scene is just being reshaped right now by, well, everything we've talked about. Geopolitics, so like those elections in Canada and Romania, showing internal and external pressures. Big economic forces. You see that in the oil market volatility from production cuts and demand shifts. And then this huge overarching drive towards an energy transition.
And Russia finding new markets, India and China playing strategically.
Exactly. Key parts of the evolving story. And the war in Ukraine, it's definitely pushed Europe faster towards green energy. But, at the end of the day, energy security, keeping the lights on affordably, that's still a massive concern everywhere.
It really just hammers home how interconnected it all is, things that seem separate on the surface. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How will the political results in Canada or Romania, combined with Europe's energy policy shifts and what India and China are doing as consumers, how will all that ultimately steer the global oil market? And I guess the speed of this whole energy transition.
It's the billion-dollar question, really, this deep dive that gives you a snapshot, a feel for the dynamics.
Right.
But honestly, each one of these pieces, Canadian politics, Romanian politics, the European Green Deal details, the long-term impact of these shifting oil flows, you could explore each one much, much deeper.
Absolutely. So much more to look into there. Well, thank you for helping us unpack all of that today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon to explore another issue shaping our world.